Hello, this is Dwight Mutonono, also known as Mnyaraji, also known as Mutos, and welcome to the Connection Desk. We are now in Acts chapter 21, verses 27 through to 40. That's the last verse of chapter 21. So, what happened before? Paul arrived at Jerusalem, and then when they went to Jerusalem, they met with James and the elders, and they could see that there could be some problems because of some of the perceptions that were there in Jerusalem about Paul's ministry. So their fear was that the Jewish Christians would actually have a problem with the way that Paul was operating in Gentile territory. And in order to ensure that the Jewish Christians would accept him, they then talked about him actually going into this vow and doing what is required, and to show the Jewish community that he is actually still a practicing Jew. So that was the strategy, that was the plan that they presented to Paul. But then that plan did not work, it backfired. And is this God's hand? We're not clear. In fact, it is God's hand in the sense that God eventually used that process to make Paul go into Rome. But the plan that they had backfired. It wasn't because the church arrested Paul or Jewish Christians, but it was actually Jewish non-believers, Jewish people who were not Christians, who were from the province of Asia, who instigated the problems when they saw Paul in the area. So now let's read from chapter 21, from verse 27 going down. It says there, when the 7 days were nearly over, some Jews from the province of Asia saw Paul at the temple. They stirred up the whole crowd and seized him, shouting, "Men of Israel, help us. This is the man who teaches all men everywhere against our people and our law at this place. And besides, he has brought Greeks into the temple area and defiled this holy place." They had previously seen Trophimus, the Ephesian, in the city with Paul, and assumed that Paul had brought him into the temple area. The whole city was aroused, and the people came running from all directions. Seizing Paul, they dragged him from the temple, and immediately the gates were shut. While they were trying to kill him, news reached the commander of the Roman troops that the whole city of Jerusalem was in uproar. He at once took some officers and soldiers and ran down to the crowd. When the rioters saw the commander and his soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. The commander came up and arrested him and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. Then he asked who he was and what he had done. Some in the crowd shouted one thing and some another. And since the commander could not get at the truth because of the uproar, he ordered that Paul be taken into the barracks. When Paul reached the steps, the violence of the mob was so great he had to be carried by the soldiers. The crowd that followed kept shouting, "Away with him!" As the soldiers were about to take Paul into the barracks, he asked the commander, "May I say something to you?" "Do you speak Greek?" he replied. "Aren't you the Egyptian who started a revolt and led 4,000 terrorists out into the desert some time ago?" Paul answered, "I am a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no ordinary city. Please let me speak to the people." Having received the commander's permission, Paul stood on the steps and motioned to the crowd. When they were all silent, he said to them in Aramaic. We'll stop there and we'll continue with the speech in the next session. So what we see here is Paul gets seized. He gets captured by the Jews who are in that in the temple area. The strategy did not work, as I said before, and the Jews saw him. Jews from the Asian province. They were from Ephesus area, Asia. The province of Asia. We're basically talking about Ephesus, and from there, the gospel then spread into the whole province. So Ephesus was in that province, and Jews in that province, particularly someone called Alexander. If you remember when we were back there, there's this man called Alexander who might have been Alexander the metal worker that's talked about in the letters of Timothy later on. But this might, Alexander opposed him, and it's Greek Jews from the Ephesus area are the ones who started this problem. They saw him and they said, "Hey, help us. This is the man who has been causing us trouble." And they accused Paul of teaching people everywhere against the Jewish people and against the Jewish law and the temple. So the accusation was against the people, the law, and the temple of Israel. And like Stephen, he was accused of teaching against the law of Moses and the temple. So, but unlike Stephen, he was accused of bringing Gentiles into the temple area. There was another accusation that he was actually bringing Gentiles into the temple area. Now, in the temple area, there is what was called the court of the Gentiles. There was somewhere where Gentiles could come. But then there were inscriptions warning Gentiles not to go past a certain point, or they would be killed. So this would be a capital punishment, and even the Romans would approve of somebody who went into that area to actually be killed by the Jewish people. There was that allowance for them to protect their temple and to not get it desecrated. So Paul's accusation, or the accusation against Paul, was that he was taking people further than that. People were aroused and came running to the temple from all directions to protect the temple. And like they did to Stephen, they wanted to kill him, probably by stoning. So they took him, they captured him, they were dragging him away. And as they did that, they closed the temple doors, and then they were, basically about to execute Paul. And while they were doing that, the Roman commander heard about it, and immediately he dispatched some troops, and because there was the fortress Antonia close to that place, so people came running, and the troops were dispatched, and the crowd, when they saw the soldiers coming, they stopped beating Paul, and they handed him over, or they allowed the soldiers and the commander to arrest Paul. So Paul was bound in 2 chains. Probably the hands and the legs were bound. And the commander then asks, after he has arrested this man who's causing all this commotion, who Paul was. And he's asking the crowd, who is this man and what has he done? And then, like most mobs, the crowd was confused. Some were shouting one thing and others were shouting another. They didn't know exactly who he was and what he was being accused of. So the commander was therefore unclear about why he was arresting Paul. But so what he did is he says, okay, let him go to the barracks. He was ordered to be taken to the barracks, and the crowd was shouting, away with him, just like they did to the Lord Jesus Christ. The thing that then happens is Paul says, he says to the commander, can I talk to you? And immediately the commander stops and says, you speak Greek? Right. So the commander was surprised that Paul spoke Greek. And he accused him of being an Egyptian who started a riot. it seems like somebody or some people maybe in the crowd were saying this is the Egyptian who started this riot or something like that. I mean, that's the only sense you can make of this thing. Why he is accusing Paul of being an Egyptian who started a riot. Maybe somebody in the crowd had shouted that. And just a bit of a background, Josephus talks of an Egyptian who tried to attack Jerusalem around that time, but was repelled by the Roman army. And he went into they ran away into the desert with about 4,000 terrorists. That's what Luke says in the account. There were 4,000 terrorists that ran with him into the desert. That's the way that the Roman commander says, aren't you the one who ran away with 4,000 terrorists into the desert? Josephus actually inflates the figure, and I think he talks about 40,000, but Luke talks about 4,000. But the point is that there was a man who was an Egyptian man who had led a riot and had gone into the desert, and Paul was mistaken for this person. Now, Paul, the commander, was surprised that Paul spoke Greek. That in itself is an indication that maybe there was something peculiar about Paul, because Greece had conquered most of that area, and those who would speak Greek most fluently would be Greek people, and who would be lighter skinned, because of course Greeks would be coming from Greece. So calling him an Egyptian who could not speak Greek might indicate that Paul was darker skinned. So there are some who have then said, okay, Paul might have been a darker skinned person and looked like a darker skinned Egyptian, probably, who did not have Greek blood. But what we are certain about is that there are cultural and possibly racial overtones in the commander's response. You are surprised maybe at the level of Greek, the accent, the ability to speak Greek so well that he heard from Paul. And then Paul explains, I'm from Cilicia. I'm from no small city, I'm from Cilicia. Cilicia made tents for the Roman army and was well respected. As I mentioned before in a previous session, that Paul's tent making, he probably learned it from his father. He was from Cilicia, from Tarsus in Cilicia, and they used to make tents for the Roman army in that land. And those people who made those tents would actually gain Roman citizenship, and that might be the way in which Paul actually gained his Roman citizenship. So Paul then explains, no, I am from Cilicia, and then explains that to the Roman commander. But an interesting thing is, he is called an Egyptian, and that is an intriguing part. A little sentence that's a very intriguing little sentence. Aramaic address. He then addresses the people in Aramaic, which is their language. So the commander allows him, you can address the crowd. He stands up and starts speaking in Aramaic. So we see here the ability of Paul to move from Greek to Hebrew to Aramaic. Just that adeptness and that ability to move through cultures is what God used to uniquely enable him, or to uniquely equip him to be the instrument that he could be for the gospel at that time. So Aramaic was the spoken language of Hebraic Jews. Jews who had not gone into the diaspora would speak Aramaic, and it would have got the attention of the crowd, because he was not speaking in the Greek language. He was not a Greek-speaking Jew, or he was not projecting or presenting himself as a Greek-speaking Jew. He was presenting himself as a Hebraic Jew, and of course, because he had been in the school of Gamaliel, he would have been speaking in Aramaic, and he would have been part of the culture of that place. So learn to be fluent in as many languages and cultures around you as possible. It helps in using or disseminating the gospel the way that we want to be effective. So it can be useful to really have adeptness in the languages and cultures around you. So that's what Paul then did, and he began to address them in Aramaic. In the next session, we'll talk about the actual address that Paul gave to the audience at that time. You are blessed. Continue in God's favor.